All right, welcome everyone to another Zoom session. This is should be very interesting. It's something probably people don't know a lot of detail about, but it was certainly disastrous to the Allies. Nigel probably needs little introduction. He's the president of the Western Australia chapter of the Naval Historical Society, and he's been a great contributor to this Zoom program, including the Battle of the River Plate. And well, how do you get to be a respected historian, knowing a lot about military, Navy and military things if you don't have any personal experience? Well, if you have a dad who had lots of experience in the Royal Navy in World War II and a large collection of books, that would help you get on top of this topic. And being born in Buenos Aires, an extensive traveling would also help, not to mention a 30-year career of traveling the world in a very large company, Citibank, to give you that international experience and understanding. However, today it's a bit slower pace, raising funds for the homeless in Perth, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this very interesting story of the fall of Singapore. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you very much, Noel. Well, good morning and welcome to my talk on the fall of Singapore. Just to acknowledge some references of material. The Battle for Singapore by Peter Thompson, the CHANGI book edited by Langland Grant, The Forgotten Highlander by Alistair Urquhart. I met Alistair actually in Edinburgh in 2011. He was 92 at his book launch, and I had long chats with him. He was one of the Highland Brigade and got captured in Singapore, and then worked on the dreaded Thai-Burma Railway, and then landed up in working in a coal mine in Japan, and went through all sorts of ghastly experiences. But he was an extraordinary character, and he told me about his time of the fall in Singapore, various websites, YouTubes, and discussions with a friend of mine, Captain Ian Warner, retired RFD of the Australian Army. Okay, let's move on. Let me start off by saying that this was and remains a very difficult, painful and dark chapter in the history of Australia, Great Britain, Singapore and its allies during World War II. Many captured Australian, British, Indian and local Malay soldiers suffered terribly as POWs, were used as forced labour. Many were tortured. Many atrocities took place by the conquering Japanese army, including against the local population, particularly Singaporean Chinese. And it's estimated 50,000 Chinese Singaporeans were put to death by the Japanese. It therefore remains a painful and very difficult topic for many people 81 years on. So one has to brace oneself when talking about this subject. So to Singapore, certainly probably the most successful city-state in the world, originally established some 200 years ago by Stamford Raffles as a trading post for the British East India Company to rival that of the Dutch Empire in the region. And we know today, of course, Singapore is an incredibly successful society, thriving with one of the world's great airlines, Singapore Airlines. So it's amazing what's happened in that city since the fall of Singapore. However, at 6:20 p.m. at WA time, last February the 15th, marked the 81st anniversary of when General Arthur Percival, the commander of all Allied forces in Singapore, formally surrendered to the Imperial Japanese Army under the command of General Yamashita. This was a disaster on an epic, massive scale that is unimaginable today. Churchill was totally shocked and called it the worst disaster in British military history. Indeed, it was the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. About 80,000 British, Indian, Australian, and Malay Strait troops in Singapore became prisoners of war, joining 50,000 taken by the Japanese in the earlier Malayan campaign. That's a total of some 130,000 persons. Many would later die performing forced labor in horrific conditions. So if we go back in time for a while, let's talk about the Singapore strategy. This was a naval defense policy of the British Empire that evolved in a series of war plans from 1919 to 1941. Its aim was to deter any aggression by the Empire of Japan, providing for a base for a fleet of the Royal Navy in the Far East, able to intercept and defeat a Japanese force heading south towards India or Australia. A cornerstone of the policy was to have a well-equipped base. Singapore at the eastern end of the Strait of Malacca was eventually chosen in 1919 as the location of this base. The work continued on this naval base and its defence over the next 2 decades through the 1920s and 30s, with both Australia and New Zealand investing in the project. The idea was that in the event of hostilities breaking out, the Royal Navy would dispatch a fleet from British waters to Singapore to deter any potential aggression. Churchill had this vision of a Singapore as being a fortress surrounded by what he described as a perfect moat, or water surrounding it on all sides and separating it from the Malay Peninsula. But the reality was it was not a fortress, but was essentially a naval base located on the northeast end of the island, facing towards Malaya, with its main defences facing out to the south of the island to repel any naval attack from the sea. Defences on the north end of the island were minimal, as an attack coming in from a northern direction it was envisaged would be repelled by troops based on the mainland of Malaya, and thus prevent a crossing onto the island of Singapore. The prevailing view was also that Malaya consisted mainly of totally impenetrable jungle that would prevent any army making any progress south towards Singapore. Singapore became nicknamed as the Gibraltar of the Far East. Now, in relation to Australia, after the First World War, Australia re-evaluated its strategic position in the world and concluded that the greatest threat to national security lay with Japan and its perceived desire to expand across the Pacific. Many parts of Asia, as we know, remained part of the British Empire at this time, including India, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong, all of which Britain wanted to protect from a Japanese advance. So Australia, by supporting the British plan to build a naval base at Singapore, was seen at the time as a sound strategic defence fit in the best interests of Australia. However, throughout the 1930s, many politicians and some defence analysts in Australia opposed the scheme, saying that Australia should itself be building a larger navy rather than investing in a single base thousands of kilometres away from Australia. And in fact, in 1936, the leader of the Labour opposition at the time, John Curtin, presciently stated that Japan was only likely to attack Singapore when Britain was preoccupied with the war in Europe, which is exactly, of course, what happened. One of a number of key factors for Japan entering the Second World War, and Japan, of course, being an industrial nation with no natural resources, included an embargo on the sale of oil supplies to Japan by the United States, Great Britain, and from the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies. This resulted in what the Japanese call the need to capture the raw materials and oil resources and what they termed the Southern Resources Area. And in effect, it was the Dutch East Indies. And a key part of the plan would be the need to capture the key strategic base of Singapore. Japan in the late 1930s had been involved in a bitter and bloody war in China and Manchuria, with fighting reaching up to the Russian border in an effort to seize resources, coal, oil, and other mineral resources to bolster its economy, to support its ambition of being the dominant power in the region. This they call the Northern Resources Area. But as the war with China reached a stalemate, they turned their attention to the Southern Resources Area, namely the Dutch East Indies, with Singapore being seen as a key to the control of the area. So let's talk a bit about the invasion of the Malay Peninsula and the Battle of Singapore. The Japanese 25th Army invaded from Indochina, moving into northern Malaya and Thailand by amphibious assault on the 8th of December 1941. This was virtually simultaneous with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which precipitated the United States' entry into the war. The Japanese then proceeded overland across the Thai-Malayan border to attack Malaya. At the same time, the Japanese began bombing Singapore. As a result of the Japanese invasion, Force Z of the Royal Navy, normally based at Gibraltar, consisting of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, the battle cruiser HMS Repulse, and 4 destroyers, sailed north out of Singapore on the 8th of December to oppose the expected Japanese landings along the coast of Malaya. In effect, the Singapore strategy was being rolled out somewhat belatedly. However, a huge disaster unfolded when Japanese land-based aircraft found and sank both the Prince of Wales and the Repulse on the 10th of December, leaving the coast of the Malayan Peninsula exposed and allowing the Japanese to continue their amphibious landings. The sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse heralded the start of the realization of the strategic importance of air power operating against battleships at sea, in this case land-based aircraft, but of course subsequently with planes operating off aircraft carriers. 840 Royal Navy crew lost their lives. Here are the numbers. Of the Repulse, 513 officers and men lost out of a total of 1,309. 796 were rescued by the destroyers HMS Electra, HMAS Vampire, and HMS Express. The Prince of Wales, 327 officers and men lost out of a total of 1,612. 1,285 were miraculously rescued by HMS Express. And also, total loss weight 840, including Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach on the Prince of Wales. The Japanese army was initially resisted in northern Malaya and by the 3rd Corps of the British Indian Army, although the 25th Japanese Army was outnumbered by Commonwealth forces in Malaya and Singapore. The Commonwealth forces did not always take the initiative under the overall command of General Percival, while Japanese commanders very much concentrated theirs in coordinated attacks. The Japanese became more and more superior in close air support, armor, coordination, tactics, and in winning most skirmishes and battles. Conventional military thinking at the time was that the Japanese forces were inferior and that the Malayan jungles were seen as impassable. The Japanese, however, were repeatedly able to use it to their advantage to outflank hastily established defensive lines. Prior to the Battle of Singapore, the most resistance that was inflicted on the Japanese during the Battle for Malaya was at the Battle of Muir, which involved the 8th Australian Division and the 45th Indian Brigade. So the Battle of Muir was the last major battle of the Malayan campaign, and it took place from the 14th to the 22nd of January 1942 around the Gemensar Bridge and on the Muir River. After this, the Allied forces were always essentially on the back foot, withdrawing further south to Singapore. After the British suffered a defeat at Slim River on the west coast of Malaya, General Archibald Wavell, overall commander in Malaya, decided that the 3rd Indian Corps should withdraw 240 kilometers south into the state of Johor to rest and regroup, while the Australian division would be used to attempt to stop the Japanese advance. So Australian soldiers under the command of Australian Major General Gordon Bennett inflicted severe losses on Japanese at the Gamesh Bridge, and a second battle a few kilometers north of the town of Gamas. Members of the Australian 8th Division killed an estimated 600 personnel from the Japanese 5th Division in the ambush at the bridge itself, whilst Australian anti-tank guns destroyed a number of Japanese tanks in the battle north of Gamas. Although the ambush was successful for the Allies, the defence of Mur and Bakri on the west coast failed, which resulted in the near annihilation of the 45th Indian Infantry Brigade and heavy casualties for its 2 attached Australian infantry battalions. As Japanese forces continued their relentless advance, they quickly isolated, surrounded and forced the surrender of Indian units defending the coast, despite their numerical inferiority. They advanced down the Malayan Peninsula, overwhelming the defences, and the Japanese also used bicycle infantry and advanced down the peninsula, overwhelming the defences. So this allowed for swift movement through the jungle. The Commonwealth forces, having thought that the terrain made them impractical, had no tanks and only a few armoured vehicles, which put them at a severe disadvantage. Although more Commonwealth units, including some from the 5th Australian Division, joined the campaign, the Japanese prevented them from regrouping. The Japanese overran cities and continued advancing rapidly towards Singapore. On the 31st of January 1942, the last Commonwealth forces crossed the causeway linking Johor to the Malay mainland in Singapore, and engineers blew it up, and that's what it looked like at that time. In only 10 weeks, the Imperial Japanese Army had rapidly, in a blitzkrieg style of warfare, had advanced, overwhelmed and seized control of the whole of Malaya from Allied Commonwealth forces, covering a distance of some 1,000 kilometers from the first landing point. This was a monumental achievement and a total disaster for the Allies. Blowing up the causeway delayed the final Japanese attack on Singapore for over a week. But here, the Japanese very quickly sorted that problem out, erecting a girder bridge over the blown gap. And here you see a picture of them at the time. They built a girder bridge over the part of the causeway that had blown up. So they very quickly dealt with that problem. Let's talk about the actual defense positions on Singapore Island now. So prior to the main assault, the Australian forces on the northeast part of the island were subjected to an intense artillery bombardment over a period of 15 hours on the 8th of February 1942. Yamashita's heavy guns fired a bombardment of 88,000 shells along the straits, cutting telephone lines and isolating forward units. The bombardment of the Australians was, however, not seen as a prelude to an attack. Central Command under Percival believed that it would last several days and would later switch its focus to the northeast side, to the northeast, despite its ferocity exceeding anything the Allies had experienced thus far in the campaign. And Percival and others believed the main Japanese attack would be on the northeast side of the island near the naval base, and thus the largest concentration of defending troops was located in the northeast near the naval base. Yamashita correctly assessed that this would be the case, and therefore concentrated the invasion to take place on the northwest side of the island, instead defended by Australian troops. Shortly before 20-30 hours on the 8th of February, the first wave of Japanese troops from the 5th Division and 18th Division began crossing the Johor Strait. The main weight of the Japanese force, about 13,000 men from 16 assault battalions. Shortly, as I say, before 20-30 hours on the 8th of February, the first wave of Japanese troops from the 5th Division and 8th Division began crossing the Johor Strait. The main weight of the Japanese forces, as I say, about 13,000 men from 16 assault battalions, with 5 in reserve, attacked the 22nd Australian Brigade. The assault was received by the 2nd 18th Battalion and the 2nd 20th Battalion. So each Japanese division had 150 barges and collapsible boats, sufficient for lifts of 4,000 men and equipment. And during the first night, 13,000 Japanese troops landed and were followed by another 10,000 after first light. The Australians numbered no more than 3,000 men and lacked any significant reserve. As the landing craft closed on the Australian positions, machine gunners from the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion, interspersed amongst the rifle companies, opened fire. Spotlights had been placed on the beaches by a British unit to illuminate an invasion force on the water, but many had been damaged by the bombardment and no order was made to turn the others on. The initial wave was concentrated against the position occupied by the 2nd 18th and 2nd 20th Battalions around the Bulow River, as well as one company from the 2nd 19th Battalion. Over the course of an hour, intense fighting took place on the right flank of the 2nd 19th Battalion until its positions were overrun. The Japanese then advanced inland, concealed by the darkness and the vegetation. The resistance put up by the company from the 2nd 19th pushed the follow-on waves of Japanese craft to land around the mouth of the Murray River, which resulted in them creating a gap between the 2nd 19th and 2nd 18th Battalions. From there, the Japanese launched 2 concerted attacks against the 2nd 18th, which were met with massed fire before they overwhelmed the Australian forces by weight of numbers. Fierce fighting raged throughout the evening, but due to the terrain and the darkness, the Japanese were able to disperse into the undergrowth, surround and overwhelm pockets of Australian resistance, or bypass them, exploiting gaps in the thinly spread Commonwealth lines due to the many rivers and creeks in the area. By midnight, the 2 Japanese divisions fired star shells to indicate to their commander they had secured their initial objectives, and by 1 o'clock in the morning, they were well established. Over the course of 2 hours, the 3 Australian battalions that had been engaged sought to regroup, moving back east from the coast towards the centre of the island, which was completed in good order. Further fighting followed in the early morning of the 9th of February, and the Australian forces were pushed back further. Bypass elements tried to break out and fell back to the Allied airfield at Tengar to rejoin their units, but suffered many casualties. The Australian commander, Gordon Bennett, attempted to reinforce forces at Tengar, but the Japanese launched another attack around the airfield and forced Australian forces onto the defensive. The initial fighting cost the Australian forces many casualties, the 2nd 20th losing 334 men killed and 214 wounded. Let's now move on to the surrender and the aftermath of POWs. The Japanese were incredibly battle-hardened, well-organized, well-supported by air and armor. Sadly, the inexperienced Allied forces could offer little resistance, and the Japanese moved with incredible speed. Allied forces were spread too thin to resist the Japanese, and they landed on the northwest side of the island on the 8th of February. And Allied air cover had been almost completely destroyed in the opening days of the campaign, so the city was being bombed at will. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Japanese moved quickly across the island. The Japanese army was also extremely brutal towards wounded soldiers, civilians, and Red Cross medical staff, as exemplified at the Alexandra barracks. And here's a picture of the at the Alexandra Barracks Hospital massacre. And here's a picture of the hospital. On the 14th of February, 1942, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Japanese had advanced towards the hospital. A British lieutenant acting as an envoy with a white flag approached Japanese forces, but was immediately killed with a bayonet. After Japanese troops entered the hospital, they killed up to 50 soldiers, including some undergoing surgery. Doctors and nurses were also killed. The next day, about 200 male staff members and patients who had been assembled and bound the previous day, many of them walking wounded, were ordered to walk about 400 meters to an industrial area. Those who fell on the way were bayoneted. The men were forced into a series of small, badly ventilated rooms where they were held overnight without water. Some died during the night as a result of their treatment. The remainder were bayoneted to death the following morning. Sounds horribly familiar, doesn't it, to another war I would suggest currently taking place, war by use of terror. With 1 million terrorized citizens as a result of atrocities being carried out, the news of which was spreading throughout the populace, all trapped in the city, and with water supplies at critical levels, the water reservoir and central water supply system having been destroyed by Japanese bombing, the overall British commander, General Arthur Percival of Singapore, was faced with the decision to either continue fighting or to surrender. What is now known, however, is that Japanese were running very low on ammunition and other supplies due to being at the limit of their supply line. The fact that the Allied Commonwealth forces had assumed the number of Japanese soldiers to be much, much higher than they were. At this point, some 25,000 versus Percival's force of 80,000. Many analysts have subsequently speculated, and it can only be described as pure speculation, that had the Allies' forces counterattacked, continued fighting in a no doubt grim campaign of fighting street by street, the Allies may have won the day. The reality of this possibly happening terrified General Yamashita, the Japanese commander, and as such, this then drove his insistent demand for a total and immediate unconditional surrender by Allied forces before the Japanese would cease hostilities. Yamashita was in effect bluffing by giving the impression they had a much larger force and could continue fighting indefinitely with consequent large numbers of civilian casualties and deaths. Percival, under severe pressure and terrified of the thought of high civilian casualties, decided there was no option to surrender. We move back to this famous grim painting. Percival and his staff officers were summoned to meet Yamashita and his staff at the Ford factory, which had only recently been completed a few years earlier. Yamashita laid out the terms for the surrender. Under the terms of the surrender, hostilities would cease at 20-30 hours. That evening, all military forces in Singapore were to surrender unconditionally. All Allied forces would remain in position and disarm themselves within an hour. The meeting took place in the boardroom of the Ford factory, and eventually at 17:15 hours, General Percival signed the unconditional surrender of all Commonwealth forces. With that single signature signed on a teak boardroom table in the boardroom of the Ford factory, more than 130,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner. Some 5 years ago, I, together with my wife, Heather, visited the Ford factory in Singapore and the room where the surrender was signed. The room is now a museum, and it was a very moving experience for us to have visited the site. There's a replica table in the room, with the original table having been acquired by the Australian War Museum in Canberra in October 1964. And if you go to the museum, you can see it there. Heather and I also have been to the museum there, and we've seen it in place in Canberra. The Japanese general Tomoyuki Yamashita had achieved a remarkable feat of arms. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced the fall of Singapore was the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. For Australia too, the fall of Singapore was a disaster. More than 15,000 Australian soldiers were captured. Of these, more than 7,000 would die as prisoners of war. Controversially, the commander of Australian forces on the island, Australian Major General Gordon Bennett, escaped the island with the 2 staff officers in the night of the surrender and made it back to Australia. Australians made up 13% of the Allied forces, the ground forces, but they suffered 73% of its battle deaths. This was a very, very heavy price paid for by Australian war dead. Following the fall of Singapore, the term the Battle for Australia was coined by Australia's wartime Prime Minister John Curtin at the time in a press release dated the 16th of February 1942 to describe the impending massive struggle to defend Australia against Japanese military aggression. During the 70-day campaign in Malaya and Singapore, total Commonwealth casualties amounted to 8,708 killed or wounded, and 130,000 were captured, as I said, of which nearly 39,000 captured were from the United Kingdom, some 18,500 were from Australian, of whom 1,789 were killed and 1,306 wounded. 67,340 were Indian and 14,382 were local volunteer troops. Japanese casualties killed or wounded were 9,824. Those who were captured were moved to the infamous Changi prison on Singapore, where many were then dispersed to different parts of Asia, including to work on the death railway in Burma and Thailand. And at this point, I just want to touch on this gentleman, Mr. Ronald Searle, who was in Changi and was also worked as enforced labour on the infamous Thai-Burma death railway. He has this incredible book he produced, and I acknowledge his book, To the Quay and Back, their war drawings that he did. And throughout his captivity, despite the risk of certain death if discovered, Ronald Searle made drawings to record his experiences. The drawings in this remarkable book were hidden by Searle, smuggled from place to place, stained with the sweat and dirt of his captivity. Many drawings were hidden under matting beds used by those dying from cholera. Other people did drawings, but these are some of the most famous. Ronald Searle was a sort of a dropout from art school in England and joined the British Army and found himself captured and then sent off to work on the fall of Singapore, sent off to work on the Thai-Burma railway. So thousands were to die by disease, malnutrition, torture and beatings, and summary executions. Dante's Inferno became a reality for all concerned, and I quote accordingly what the POWs must have felt. Abandon all hope, you who enter here. And here are some of here are Australian troops arriving in Singapore, and literally 2 weeks later, they were in Changi or being sent to the death railway. Here's some of Ronald Searle's drawings. This is a picture of Changi that he did, a drawing of Changi. It was apparently originally designed on the same basis as Alcatraz, of all places. Here are pictures of cholera lines by Searle, people dying of cholera, and there's some bodies on grass matting beds where he used to hide his drawings. Grim stuff. This is what went on. And here is somebody suffering from malnutrition in Changi. So I just now want to move on to talk about the Australian commanders. Major General Gordon Bennett, he was a hero of World War I at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. He was the commander of Australian forces. He had a lot of contempt for British senior officers. Apparently, he was very argumentative, with an outspoken nature and a confidence in his own ability. And Bennett clashed with Percival and other generals of the Allied command in Singapore. He seemed to have a great ability to keep arguing with everybody, which didn't go down that well. But unlike the other senior officers, Bennett very controversially decided to escape from Singapore rather than remaining with his troops just hours after Percival had signed the surrender and made it back to Australia. This matter remains very controversial to this day. Now, this is the man who took over. Bennett, once he decided to escape from Singapore, handed over command of Australian forces to Brigadier Cecil Callaghan. Percival promoted him to temporary Major General to ensure he had sufficient status with the Japanese as commander of all Australian forces in Singapore. And there are tales of very hurriedly the relevant insignias being put onto his epaulets at the top to make him a Major General. He was a tall man, and the Japanese, being much shorter, didn't necessarily notice the new insignias on his epaulets, apparently. He was made a prisoner of war and was held in a former British Army barracks near Changi prison. He was later held in camps in Formosa, Japan, and lastly in Manchuria, from where he was liberated by the Red Army in August 1945. In subsequent investigations and commissions into Bennett's escape, Callaghan confirmed he was critical and ashamed of Bennett and did not approve of Bennett's escape. Okay, let's move on to now some conclusions and reflections 81 years on. So I want to break this down into two parts now. Firstly, some reasons I would suggest for the fall of Singapore, and secondly, what this eventually led to in terms of Australia's future foreign and defence policy. So some reasons for Singapore's fall were as follows from my research, from articles I read, books I read, scholarly information. Firstly, an incredibly arrogant disdain by the British in Singapore and from others, not just the Brits, believing the Japanese to be an inferior race to the British and Anglo-Saxon race in general. A massive underestimation of the fighting capabilities of the Japanese army, which were perceived to be no match to British, Australian, other Commonwealth forces. This is despite, according to Peter Thompson's book, that as far back as 1924, a Major Alford of the British Army had written reports that the Japanese army is the most powerful fighting force in the world. And in 1937, a report from the British military attaché in China, who'd seen Japanese forces in Shanghai and described the Japanese army as formidable and well able to cope against any army. So these reports did exist, and I think Percival at one point did review them prior to him being sent to Singapore. A view that the Malay jungle was impenetrable and that no army supported by tanks or other support vehicles could make its way through the jungle at high speed. That an invasion attack on Singapore would come from the sea and not from the mainland. A somewhat naive view that Singapore was an impregnable fortress surrounded by a moat. A complete lack of effective defence installations, particularly on the north end of Singapore Island. A total miscalculation by Percival that the main Japanese attack would take place on the northeast end of the island, where most of the Allied troops were positioned, and the correct assessment by Yamashita of working this out, and thus his decision to land on the northwest side of Singapore Island instead, that was lightly defended in numbers by Australian troops, who then had to engage with the total force of the Japanese invasion. a failure to reinforce the Australians on the northwest side with troops from the northeast quadrant till it was too late. A complete lack of heavy armour, most of it having been sent to North Africa, of course, to fight Rommel. A rapid collapse in morale of forces once the Japanese were at the gates of Singapore City, that resulted in many soldiers effectively giving up to inevitable defeat. And finally, a failure of leadership by the most senior officers involved, including the very controversial escape from Singapore on February the 15th of the Australian commanding officer Gordon Bennett, who escaped back to Australia. So what this eventually led to in terms of Australia's future foreign and defence policy, let's talk a bit about that. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 made Australia realise it could no longer rely on Great Britain to defend it anymore in the event of major warfare in the region. Thus, it turned to the United States in 1942 as a partner to ally with it in its defence, and that still endures to this day with a new twist, as we know, namely the AUKUS alliance of Australia, the UK and the US. It made Australia finally realise that it was truly a part of the Asian region and should no longer rely as such on the mother country, Great Britain. Today, I believe, Japan, I believe, is Australia's second biggest export market, principally from iron ore and minerals. And Japan is part of a defence and wider strategic alliance with Australia. Of course, recently, Australia looked to possibly purchasing Japanese submarines as a replacement for our current Collins-class submarines. So the world has certainly changed massively, and Australia's relationship with Japan, thankfully, is in a far, far better place than it was 81 years ago. So I just want to say something about Yamashita, what happened to him. He was tried for war crimes and executed in the Philippines as the Allies and the Americans and so on and Australians won the war in the Pacific, and he was sent to the Philippines to defend that, and he was eventually tried for war crimes by a US military tribunal and executed in the Philippines. Percival was present at Yamashita's trial in the Philippines and stared him down. Percival was also at the surrender of the Japanese in Tokyo Bay on board the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September, 1945.
Nigel, I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes. I had another engagement as well, but I caught 90% of it. So incredible amount of research you've done, and you know, really painted a pretty depressing picture, really, of the whole operation and engagement, the fall of Singapore.